The seminar you're joining us here for today is part of a professional development series that we've been running at EE New South Wales over the past couple of months. So we've been looking at nature connection programs across different sectors. So we did some with early childhood, primary educators, and this one here is, I suppose, looking more at adults for local government and community educators. The program has been supported by the New South Wales Government through the Environmental Trust. So thanks for that. And today, we've got our speaker here today is Melissa Hatty. So Melissa is joining us from Melbourne, Victoria. And I'll just introduce Melissa. Melissa's a research fellow at BehaviourWorks Australia, Monash University, and a registered health psychologist. So she sounds like a busy lady. She is also, I can call her Dr. Melissa Hatty. She recently was awarded her PhD, and her PhD was looking at investigating connections with nature and the interplay between reconnecting people with nature and biodiversity conservation behaviours. Melissa's going to speak probably for about an hour today, and then we've left a bit of time at the end for some time for discussion. So we were thinking that if you have some questions, maybe if you want to put them in the chat and then we can come back to them, or you can hold on to your questions and you can just speak to Melissa. We'll just do that as part of the group forum at the end of the session. I think that's all from me. So I'm going to hand you over to Melissa. Okay, thanks everyone.
Perfect, thanks Danielle. Let me just share my screen. So, bit of a thumbs up there. You can all see the screen. Good. All right. So thank you for the very warm introduction, and thank you for everyone for coming today. I am in Melbourne and it's very wet and cold. I hope you're warm and dry and safe where you are today. I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. For me, that's the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I would like to pay my respects to ancestors and to elders and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I would also like to express my sincerest gratitude for the care that traditional custodians have taken of country over millennia, such that we are able to live and prosper here today. So as Danielle mentioned, I'm a research fellow at Monash University. BehaviourWorks is part of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. My PhD was a partnership with the Victorian State Government, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and they have a biodiversity strategy that was released in 2017. One of the key pillars of that is their Victorians Value Nature program. And so they were looking specifically to understand how fostering connections with nature can be an important part of their biodiversity conservation strategy. So my research was focused in that space. My presentation today is quite academically focused. I'm an academic, that's what I do. But I'm really, really interested to know how this could be applied, and if it is indeed already being applied in the real world on the ground in what you guys are doing. So again, which is why I left a bit of space at the end to have that kind of conversation. But before we get started today, if this presentation is going to work, I would invite you to just take a moment to ground yourself where you are, and to maybe wiggle around, find a comfy spot, take a deep breath, and to bring to mind a nature experience or a nature place or a time or an event where you might have felt particularly connected to nature. It might be a location or a place or an event that you went to. And just see if you can use your sensory experience to bring that to mind. See if you can notice what you see in front of you. See if you can hear elements of nature. See if you can engage with all of your senses, the touch, feeling, breeze, and just noticing what this experience does by bringing this image to mind. What kind of emotional experience comes with engaging with nature. And I use this as a foundation because connection with nature is often a very visceral experience. And part of what I'll talk about today is how we think about connection with nature from an academic perspective, talking about it in terms of how it's defined, how it's conceptualized. And the next part, I'll step into what we know about nurturing connection, the types of characteristics or factors that have been associated with nurturing connection. And then jumping into measurement, how we measure it in different ways. And then having a look at how connection relates to sustainability and what we know from the literature about this particular set of relationships. But the first start, I will first jump into definition and thinking about what is connection with nature, how do we think about it? So the literature is absolutely awash with connection with nature definitions. The literatures are probably 20, 25 years old, real proliferation since about the late 1990s, early 2000s. Lots of different definitions, but we tend to see some commonalities in those definitions. So connection with nature is typically thought of as a relatively stable construct, a sense of personal identity. It's a very intimate thing. My connection might be different to someone else's connection. And it's about a relationship. It's about a bond that we form with nature. And it includes thoughts. So it includes things like behaviours, it includes beliefs, attitudes, knowledge, as well as emotional experiences. Most commonly, it includes the kind of positive emotions. So we talk about the feelings of awe and wonder that we might feel in relation to nature. Less often, the literature talks about the negative emotions, but that's something I'll touch on a bit later on. And also behaviours. So connection with nature is associated with wanting to spend time with nature or enjoying being in nature or wanting to protect nature. So there's a behavioural element as well. Another thing to think about with connection with nature is when a lot of the literature first started to blossom, we thought of connection as a unidimensional construct. It was almost you were connected or you weren't, and then there was kind of gradings in between. More recently, we've started to think of connection as multidimensional. So there are different types of connection. This particular image comes from a paper that Chris Ives and his team published in 2018. They did a big review of all of the connection with nature literature and found that there were different types, 5 different types of connection that they identified. And they think of it from the perspective of the level of the individual right up to the level of society. So is Australian society, for example, more or less connected on these different dimensions to perhaps another society, as well as internal and external. So what I feel compared to kind of the more material experiential stuff that happens external to me. These dimensions are distinct, but they're related to each other. And so we know, for example, an experiential kind of connection that someone might have by having an experience of nature that can influence our thoughts about nature, that can influence our emotions about nature. So they're highly related, highly correlated. It's also worth noting that these are not the only dimensions. These are the ones that have been identified in the literature, but there's very likely many more than what's listed here. Another thing to think about with connection is whether we think about it in terms of a state or a trait. So the literature often thinks about it as a relatively stable construct, so which is more a trait type thing, almost like a personality trait. But we also know that connection can be manipulated. It is a moment in time. So for example, if you ask someone about their connection with nature and then you take them on a nature walk, and then you ask them again about their connection, often that score will increase. That connection with nature score will increase. And so that suggests that it's a state as well. It's a moment in time. Another thing to point out is the literature suggests that there's connection can actually be influenced by seasons and weather. So on a rainy, cold day like today in Melbourne, if we ask someone about how connected to nature they felt, they'd probably say not very. Whereas if it's beautiful sunshine and they're out enjoying nature in a warm kind of temperature, more likely to say they're feeling connected. So again, this is highlighting it's kind of a state as well as a trait. And what we kind of understand about this in terms of state versus trait, it's not something that's discussed much in the literature. We sort of tend to assume that it's a trait and that's it, which is a shame because it needs to be more discussion about how these two types of connection interact. But the consensus seems to be that a single experience of nature, a state, is important. But in order to foster a trait, that more enduring quality, you need to have those repeated experiences over time. And so, again, the focus is often on kids, because if we can nurture connection in children, over time, that builds up to that state, which then becomes more enduring as a trait. Also worth noting too that it's the quality of the experiences of nature that make a difference. And again, I'll jump into this in a moment, but if you think yourself, if you just kind of walk through a park on your way to work, you might be distracted by your phone. That's a very different experience to if you're actively engaging with nature, if you're actually paying attention to it. So the quality of the experience that you have in nature has a big influence on the development of and expression of connection. So the next part I'll jump into is looking what we know about connection and what is associated with developing connection, how we can nurture it. We know that individual differences have been associated with connection. So, for example, personality characteristics, environmental values. People who are more altruistic tend to be more connected to nature. We know that people who are more empathic tend to be more connected to nature. Character strengths like curiosity also tends to be associated with connection. Mindfulness, that kind of being in the moment idea, that can be both a state and a trait. So you can be mindful in that moment, or you can be mindful as a more enduring quality. All of these things have been associated with connection. Now, I mention these not because they're not necessarily easily to manipulate. Things like personality characteristics tend to be fairly stable, so we kind of can't incorporate them, I guess, into our education programs. But it's worth remembering that these are related in the sense of the people that come to your programs will have a certain set of characteristics that may or may not help to kind of foster that sense of connection. There was an interesting study done a couple of years ago that looked at connection across the lifespan. Now, this particular study was done in the UK, I believe. The NR6, you'll see the score on the left-hand side there. This is a measure of trait connection, nature relatedness. And you'll see that the general trend is often in young children, connection tends to be quite high. And then it dips down sort of in adolescence. And then it kind of comes up again once we get into early 20s and 30s. And then it's relatively stable across the lifespan. You'll also notice the red lines at the top, and I apologize to anyone who's colorblind. The red lines at the top is the females, the blue at the bottom. And you tend to see the literature generally suggests that females tend to be slightly more connected than males. As to why that is, open for discussion, but it's an interesting point worth noting. So when we're looking at connection in childhood, early life experiences can be absolutely pivotal. And Louise Chawler has done a lot of work in this area. She published a paper a few years ago that looked at some of the characteristics that are really important for developing connection in children. Experiences of nature was one of the most important. So allowing children to have that experience of going out and building things, of climbing trees, of playing with rocks, of playing with bugs, definitely contributes to developing that sense of connection. And coupled with this is this idea of access. So if you have access to nature, you're more likely to develop that sense of connection because you can spend time in it. Kids that are in the city that maybe don't have the same level of access to nature tend to be less connected as a consequence. Influential adults is another important thing. So if you have a parent or a teacher or another adult mentor who takes you out into nature, who encourages that kind of connection, more likely to develop that kind of stronger, enduring sense. And as we saw on the previous slide, age and gender are relevant as well. So Interestingly, there's been some work recently looking at trying to nurture a sense of connection in adolescence during that time when connection tends to dip. And a lot of the work now is using technology, so using apps and gamification to try to encourage teenagers to actually get out and engage with the natural world in order to nurture this sense of connection. When we're starting to look at connection in adulthood, much of the same factors that influence development of connection are relevant in both adulthood as well as childhood. Miles Richardson is based over in the UK. His team have done some work looking at the different pathways to connection. And 5 of the pathways that they have identified are listed here. And these are considered ways of kind of engaging people in order to develop that sense of connection. And so they talk about through the senses, so using all senses. If you're just sitting and looking at something, as opposed to looking, touching, smelling, experiencing on a kind of a richer level, that using multiple senses is going to nurture that sense of connection to a greater extent. Emotion is really important. So that sense of awe and wonder and surprise, if you look at a sunset and go, wow, that's going to nurture a sense of connection. Similarly with beauty, being able to notice and appreciate and reflect on that sense of beauty that you experience when you're out into nature. Again, tied into this idea of emotion and also tied into meaning, the next one. To bring that sense of beauty and appreciation is a pathway to developing connection. Meaning is about encouraging people to reflect on what nature means in our lives. So noticing how often nature appears in poetry, in books, in movies, in literature, how it's an important part of us. It's not just something that's kind of, out the window, out there. It's actually brings a lot of meaning to our lives. And encouraging this meaning appears to help develop this sense of connection. And the 5th pathway is compassion. So this is caring for nature. And this is an important one, which we'll get to later when we talk about environmental behaviours. But the actual act of caring for nature, of wanting to take care of nature, has an important role to play in actually nurturing connection in adulthood. So when we look at characteristics of nature experiences, when you're developing programs to nurture connection, considering a lot of these factors can help to sort of build up this big picture of how to nurture a sense of connection in both children and adults. So again, these repeated experiences over time. Unfortunately, many of our programs are often a moment in time. But we know that if we can repeat those experiences over time, we've got a better chance of developing that more enduring, the state becomes trait, that more enduring kind of trait connection. Exploration with few boundaries. This is really important for kids, but it's equally as important for adults. I did a day recently of nature therapy and encouraged to just go out and explore the botanical gardens in Melbourne without any boundaries, without any instructions. Very rough, go out and use your senses, pick up things, smell, that kind of thing. And that kind of unstructured exploration is such an important component for encouraging people to not only actively engage with nature, but also develop their sense of connection. A physical or a psychological challenge also seems to be important. And this is particularly relevant when we think about things like bush adventure therapy, when you might spend a day or multiple days out in nature, physically challenging yourself, maybe learning to cross a river or supporting other people through a particular challenge. And the psychological challenge that comes with these multi-day expeditions can be particularly useful for nurturing that sense of connection. Other factors, social support and social and cultural norms. So if your immediate vicinity, if the social kind of group that you find yourself in are also very supportive of this idea of connecting and spending time in nature, that's going to be much more conducive. Whereas a culture that maybe has a fear of nature or is more kind of removed from nature, that's going to have a very different outcome in terms of developing connection. Creative expression also seems to be important. So this is both drawing or creating something in or with parts of nature, elements of nature, putting a bunch of kids down and giving them rocks and sticks and twigs and saying, go make something. That's a really great way of nurturing connection. But it can also be a more artistic kind of drawing or painting or writing about your experiences of nature can also have a really useful way of developing connection. And the level of intimacy, the kind of personal experience, is also important. Given what we said earlier about it being a personal identity, it's a very personal experience. Being able to develop that sense of intimacy with nature, to actually get hands-on and create that level of closeness, has a really important role to play in developing connection. There was a paper came out last year, again from the UK. This ENACT tool was looking at characteristics of nature experiences to try to determine, is there a way that we can measure programs that try to connect people with nature to determine whether or not they're meeting criteria to develop a connection. And some of the factors that they identified were, if a program is able to encourage people to learn something new, so they might learn something about a local area or learn something about a particular species. A program that's interesting and informative, something that sparks that kind of curiosity in people, is also important. Again, positive emotions have come up. So creating a sense of calm, feeling excited, feeling amazed, all of these characteristics, if you can encourage these within your programs, there's a more likely to produce that sense of connection as a result. The meaning of the place and the location. So place attachment's a big one. We often have a particular connection to a particular location, whether it's because of a childhood experience or somewhere where we live, and being able to nurture that sense of meaning to that place can also incorporate that into a program, can also really encourage connection. Distraction from stress, being able to forget your problems for a while, is also important. And stimulating concern, this ties back into the pathway of compassion. So if your program is teaching someone about a particular area or about a species, but it's also encouraging that concern for nature, that's going to create a stronger sense of connection as a result. Now, if we come back to that earlier definition of connection, in that it's relatively stable, it's kind of a trait, it's a personal identity, it's a relationship. If we think about the thoughts and the emotions and behaviours that sort of fall under this definition, any education programs that incorporate these things have a good chance of then encouraging that nurturing of connection. And so education programs that include knowledge, for example, or trying to shift attitudes or beliefs could be useful, as well as thoughts about beauty, tranquility, thoughts about nature in terms of that multisensory kind of set of characteristics. Also emotions, and so having people to asking your participants to reflect on how the natural experience makes them feel, how the program makes them feel, will encourage that kind of reflection on nature in an emotional sense. And as well as behaviours, so the activities that you encourage people to participate in, I'm guessing more often than not include actually being out in nature, and that will, just as a pure product of being there, will encourage that sense of connection to develop. So the next part I'll talk about today is how connection is and can be measured. Before I jump in, though, it's worth just revisiting connection as a construct and thinking about, how do we think about connection when we're trying to measure it? So if we think about connection as a unidimensional construct, we'll measure that quite differently to if we consider it from a multidimensional perspective. And to give you an example, if your program focuses on developing that emotional connection, for example, you might measure connection by asking people, how does this activity make you feel? Reflecting on your emotions. If the program is more about nurturing knowledge about nature, then the way that you assess connection might be more that cognitive level. So assessing their attitudes or thoughts about nature, beliefs, knowledge about nature. The other thing to think about is state versus trait. As I mentioned earlier, we often consider nature as a trait, consider connection as a trait, but whether we capture that at that moment in time or whether we capture it as a more enduring quality is worth thinking about. Some of the instruments, which I'll introduce in a minute, have been tweaked to try to capture a state. So they ask questions like, at this moment, or as a result of this activity, how do you feel? What's your relationship? And that's specifically intended to capture a state. Whereas if we're trying to capture a more enduring trait, the questions that we ask and the way that we ask those questions might be slightly different. And again, thinking about that change over time. So again, if you're fortunate enough to engage people repeatedly over a period of time, being able to try to capture that change over time is something to think about as well. So some of the ways that people have captured connection from a qualitative perspective. So interviews is quite common, asking people to sort of reflect on their experiences, what's happened, how did you feel? Similarly with journaling, getting people to reflect at the end of an activity, to write a little bit down, what happened for you, what came up, what did you experience? Similarly with photography, a lot of researchers have got people to go out and take photos of things and then ask them, why did you take this photo? What does it mean? Reflecting on that photography. Drawings is another way to capture connection. This is particularly useful with children, asking them to draw their favorite place or draw their favorite animal, and again, then reflecting on that particular drawing. The implicit measures is an interesting one. Wesley Schultz was pivotal in developing these many years ago. And for those of you who aren't aware of these, it's an interesting program that's often used by a computer. And the idea is they present words on a screen and then they test your reaction time. And so, for example, they might show me and then they might show tree, rock, animal. And then the control condition will be, say, a built environment. So it might be car or building. And the idea is that when they show they show me and then tree, if the reaction time is quicker to respond than me and car, then that implies an implicit connection to nature. The reaction time is quicker that way. And a lot of these techniques were used to get around this idea of having to actually put into words what your relationship with nature might be. This idea of an implicit connection gets around that idea of having to think about, oh, how connected to nature am I? So they can be quite useful. Visual scales is another way that we capture connection. Again, Wesley Schultz developed this back in 2001. The inclusion of nature in self-scale is probably one which many of you have already seen. The idea is two concentric circles, me and nature, or self and nature. And the idea being that the further away those two circles are, the more distant the relationship, the lower the connection. If we look at the last one there, G, the completely overlapping circles indicates a very strong connection. From a research perspective, there's a few issues with these scales because they're a single item. The psychometrics are not great. I won't bore you with the details, but there's been adaptations of these scales to try to make them a bit more robust from a research perspective. And so this other paper in 2016 looked at not just the circles, but also the size. So if nature is considered small versus big, does that somehow show that relationship? Another one being distance, so two lines that kind of come together or move apart, again, to show the closeness of relationship with nature. Another adaptation has been an illustrated version. One line of thought goes that just having the word self and nature is not sort of representative necessarily and doesn't tap into this idea of what people think of. So can we put pictures in there to make it a bit easier to understand? It's also a bit more useful for people who may not have English as a first language or who may not have the same kind of thought processes about nature. So the theory goes that having these images makes it a bit easier to understand. The inclusion of nature in self-scale has been used to capture both state and trait. It's depending on how you frame it. So if you frame the question that says, what is your relationship with nature generally, then that's believed to capture more of a trait. If you say right now, which image represents your relationship with nature, that's more of a state way of capturing it. This particular scale is great in a real world setting because it's a single question, really, really quick and dirty if you need to get a measure quickly. There's also been in the last few years, a proliferation of self-report questionnaires, and in the last few years, there's been about 20 different instruments that have been developed. Some of them think about connection as a unidimensional construct. So connectedness to nature scale, Mayer and France in 2004 developed, that was supposed to be capturing emotional connection. There's an argument whether it's emotional or cognitive. The love and care for nature scale, Perkins, that was again supposed to capture the emotional connection. And the nature connection index is a sort of a general sense of connection that they use that for both adults and kids. Some of these scales are multidimensional. So the environmental identity scale, the nature relatedness scale are quite long. Multidimensional, but they're also quite long. The environmental identity scale has 24 questions, so it can take a bit of time to kind of answer the questions. The response scales are generally things like agree to disagree on questions, or you might answer, this is very close to me, or it's not like me at all. A few years ago, TAM did a review of these questionnaires to see, are they actually measuring the same thing? The take-home message was they're basically measuring the same thing. The conclusion was that all of these instruments have nuance in that they capture specific sort of elements, but the idea being that there's like a common core. So there's sort of a connection with nature, and then there's different types of connection that kind of float around the outside. And so it's good from a perspective of evaluation, because you know that whichever scale you use, you're probably going to capture the same kind of thing. But following on from this idea of multidimensionality, if we come back to the Ives model, the 5-dimensional model, part of my PhD, we wanted to develop a questionnaire that was multidimensional, but also brief. So we used the Ives model as a foundation and came up with 3 dimensions that broadly represented the model that Ives proposed. We found that the emotional and the cognitive dimensions were kind of mushed in together under identity, and there wasn't a lot of support for the material dimension, so that got dropped. But this has got 12 questions, hence CN12, that also captures these 3 different dimensions. Now, the identity dimension, this is someone who sort of sees themselves as being emotionally attached to nature, someone who acts to protect nature, someone who kind of thinks, I'm the kind of person that does that sort of thing. The identity dimension, as I said, captured both thoughts and emotions. These 2 dimensions were smushed in together. From a statistical perspective, this dimension accounted for the most variance. So if you think of it as the biggest piece of the pie, for me, it seems like identity is almost that common core that Tam was talking about in terms of the type of connection. The experience dimension was about this particular type of connection, was about experiences both in and with nature, being drawn to spending time in nature, but also getting enjoyment and a sense of belonging from spending time in nature. And the philosophy dimension captured a relationship. It's almost that spirituality side of things. So having that responsibility to care for nature, believing that humans are part of nature or that they are nature. And that was the final dimension. It's also worth noting that even though these dimensions are separate, they are strongly related. So they were highly correlated. And again, identity accounting for the most variance. So that seems to be the biggest piece of the pie. And the implications for this relate to how we use this in assessing programs. So there was a paper published a couple of years ago that looked at these different types of connection, these different dimensions, and how they relate to each other. And it seems that cognitive and experiential connection have the strongest relationships with the other dimensions. And so if we look at if we wanted to focus on a particular dimension or a type of connection, where would we sort of get the most bang for buck in terms of focus? And again, Identity seems to be the strongest one. So both the thoughts and the emotional experience of that relationship with nature. Another thing too worth considering is if we develop that sense of identity in relation to nature, actually doing it while you're in nature encapsulates both the identity and experience dimensions at the same time. And that could potentially be a really useful place to target. So coming across to relationships between nature, a connection with nature and sustainability. So environmental behaviour in the academic literature, there's a few different ways that we think about it, but most commonly we talk about pro-environmental behaviour. Now, this is considered a really diverse set of behaviours that are of general benefit to the environment. And this could be everything from recycling to turning the heater down to taking public transport to eating organic food. Oftentimes you'll see people will ask a whole series of questions about different things and then put it together in a single scale and try to call that a metric of pro-environmental behaviour. A couple of years ago, there was 2 meta-analyses published, really good high quality evidence meta-analyses that found that there was a moderate to strong relationship between connection with nature and pro-environmental behaviour. More recently, researchers have started to look at behaviours that are of specific benefit to biodiversity. So you can think of biodiversity behaviours, conservation behaviours as almost a subset of pro-environmental behaviour. And this is a really growing body of research. It's only been in the last few years that people have started to look specifically at biodiversity behaviours. But again, there seems to be a fairly moderate strength of relationship between these ideas. And so the message is that people who are more connected, they do more to protect nature. And it's also worth noting that this relationship goes both ways. So we know that people who are more connected do more to protect nature, but also doing environmental behaviours nurtures a sense of connection. So there seems to be that feedback loop between these constructs. A lot of the literature seems to suggest that connection leads to behaviour. One of the papers I looked at in my PhD was, does behaviour predict connection? And the answer is yes, it does. So something else I looked at in my PhD was whether these different dimensions of connection, these different types of connection relate to behaviours in different ways. And what I found was identity was actually more important. So for behaviours like environmental volunteering, citizen science, they had a stronger relationship with the identity dimension than they did with the total connection with nature score. So for me, this is suggesting that if we want to encourage these types of behaviours, nurturing that sense of identity is probably going to be a really good place to direct your attention. Having people encouraging that idea of I'm the kind of person that has a relationship with nature, and then they're likely to then go out and do more to protect nature. Another thing I looked at in my research, when you have a look at the connection with nature literature, very rarely does anyone define nature. We talk about connection with nature, but what does nature mean? And we know that people think about nature differently. So people from different language groups, from different cultures have different ideas about nature. They use different words to describe nature. And we also know that past experiences of nature influences how you think about it. So if you've had a really bad experience of, say, being attacked in nature, your thoughts about nature are going to be very different to someone that's had a very positive experience of nature. So one of the studies I looked at in my research we asked people, what comes to mind when you think about nature? And some people wrote one word, some people wrote sentences, and I spent many months coding this information and trying to group these concepts together into what I call concepts of nature, which is basically how people think about, describe, understand nature. And broadly came up with 3 categories. And then the 4th complex one is a combination of the other 3. So descriptive is basically what nature is, how people describe it. So a tree, a beach, a forest. Often people would describe multiple parts of nature, but all basically fell under this descriptive category. Normative talks about life, systems in balance, needing protection. So words like sustainability came up a lot. And this was this idea about how nature is valued. Another concept that was quite prominent was this idea of experiential concepts of nature. And this is how nature is enjoyed. So it wasn't just, I mean, it was activities in nature, so things like camping, hiking, fishing, but it was also experiences from a psychological perspective. So an experience of beauty, seeing nature as tranquil, seeing nature as something that is colorful, that is amazing smells, people who described it in terms of positive emotions as well. So awe and wonder and happiness and surprise. These kind of descriptions of nature were how nature is enjoyed, roughly. That experiential kind of concept of nature is almost a richer picture of what nature is and what it means. And as I mentioned, the complex category was a combination. So sometimes people described it in terms of what nature is, sort of labels for different parts of nature, as well as normative or as well as experiential. And when I looked at how these concepts of nature related to connection, what I found was people who describe nature in descriptive terms, so the labels for nature, so things like tree, forest, animal, tended to have lower connection with nature scores. People who describe nature in the kind of richer terms, so from an experiential or a complex perspective, tended to have much higher connection with nature scores. So it seems that people who describe nature in terms of activities or the kind of emotions like love, tranquility, who talk about the sensory experience, who are able to describe nature relative to smells, for example, tend to have a much higher connection with nature score. The other thing I found was that there was a relationship between behaviours, biodiversity behaviours, and connection that was a function of how people think about nature. So the general trend across the board, as the meta-analysis I described earlier indicates, is low scores of connection are associated with less behaviour, less environmental behaviour. As the connection with nature score goes up, so too does the frequency of the behaviour, typically. What I found was that for people that describe nature in experiential terms, so again, this kind of richer picture of activities in nature, but also awe and wonder and tranquility and beauty, the relationship between connection and behavior was fairly consistent. So at low levels of connection, they were still going to do the behavior. At high levels of connection, they were still going to do the behavior. And I looked at the reverse as well. So the connection actually predicted behavior in a similar kind of way. But what was interesting is that people that described nature in terms of descriptions, labels, complex or normative terms, as connection with nature increased, so too did the behavior. And this is important in the context of developing programs that might either target environmental behaviours to nurture connection or nurturing connection as a way of encouraging behaviours. These types of interventions might not be as effective for people that consider nature in experiential terms. They might be most effective for people that use descriptive terms, for example. And tying this all together, what does this mean for our education programs? Well, the bottom point there, as I said, how people think about nature is a potentially important consideration. People who are describing nature in descriptive terms are going to have potentially different outcomes in terms of the relationship between the connection and the behaviour than someone who considers nature in a richer kind of description. Jumping up to the top, so there's a relationship between connection and behaviour, and we know that relationship is bidirectional. It's a feedback loop. So programs to nurture connection can either aim to nurture connection with the view to increasing the environmental behaviours, or you could also put the behaviours into the programs. So for example, we know that going on a tree planting day, for example, will have a really positive effect in terms of nurturing connection. The other thing to think about is this idea of identity. So again, if identity is the biggest piece of the pie of connection with nature, nurturing that sense of identity is going to be a really useful place to target in order to nurture that sense of connection in our program participants. It does have relationships with different behaviours, but again, not a lot of research in this area. And the other thing comes back to this idea of how nature is communicated. So people that think about nature in richer terms tend to have higher connection with nature scores. So if we can talk to people about nature is beautiful, or notice that emotional experience, notice how that makes you feel, it's likely to have an influence on how people then develop that sense of connection. As with everything in the research literature, there's always gaps, there's always ongoing programs of what we don't know. There's a lot of questions that are still there in the literature about what we don't know. And one of the things is, how does connection relate to behaviour? So we know that people who are more connected do more to protect nature, but we don't know how or why. What are the mechanisms? We know there's a feedback loop, but again, we don't know how and why. There's not a lot of research looking at different dimensions, and the 5 that I mentioned earlier are only some of them. There's potentially other dimensions there. Are there different types of connection that we can nurture to get particular behavioural outcomes? State and trait. So we know that trait connection is associated with more behaviour, and if we need to have repeated experiences over time, repeated states of connection to develop trait, what's the pathway, what's the mechanism, and how does that work? You know, how many times do you need to have a nature experience to develop a trait connection with nature? Another thing that's really missing in the literature is how connection with nature differs across cultural groups. Most of the research in this area has been with what we call weird populations, so Western, industrialized, educated, rich, democratic. We have very little understanding about how this idea of connection with nature applies to other groups. And this is particularly the case with Indigenous people. There's been some research come out recently in Israel looking at Bedouin people and how concepts of connection with nature differs. But it's a really big gap in the literature. We don't know how connection relates to other cultural groups, or whether it's even relevant. And as I alluded to earlier, negative experiences of nature. Most of the time we assume that nature is good, nature is positive, nature makes us feel great. But this idea of biophobia, we don't know a lot about how negative experiences play out in terms of both emotions and the impact that it has on connection. So to give you a bit of a summary with take-home messages, connection with nature is a multidimensional construct, and thinking about it in terms of the different types of connection is important. Whether it's a state versus a trait has implications for how we think about it as a construct. Experiences to nurture connection in both adults and kids, but particularly in adults, having that active engagement is really important. Merely sitting under a tree looking at nature is not the same as actively engaging with the senses, with creating meaning, with feeling that emotion. And tapping into emotions, thoughts, and behaviours, both in terms of what we include in programs to nurture connection, but also how we measure connection. And again, this comes down to the measurement side of things as well, whether we consider it unidimensional, multidimensional. There are questionnaires. That's probably the most common way of measuring connection, but there are other methods as well. And I'll, in the information that we send out after the workshop, there's a really lovely paper that summarizes these different methods and when they might be appropriate for which type of context. So I'll send that around as well. And the final one is connection and behaviour. So we know that there's a bidirectional relationship, and that a richer, more detailed understanding of nature seems to be associated with a stronger connection. And that's all I have. I have a very long list of references, which I'll send out, Danielle will send out after the workshop, if you want to read up any more on any of this information. So thank you.
That's great. Thanks everyone. If we can just give you a round of applause, Melissa. It's hard to do that online, but it's it was really comprehensive, and it's really great to have so much of that research kind of digested and presented to us in a form that we can really think about and potentially use in our programs as well. We have had a few questions in the chat, so perhaps I might just go back and look at some of the questions from the beginning. I might run through a couple if people are happy for me to just read the questions that are in the chat. But if you did want to say something or ask something, just, put your hand up or put it in the chat. So I'll just go back to Jonathan's question. And he says, can you please explain a bit more about the difference between identity and the philosophical dimensions of CN?
That's an interesting question. Susan Clayton has done a lot of work in this space back in the early 2000s, and her concept of identity was very much about who am I as a person and how do I incorporate nature into me and my sense of self. And so she kind of looked at it from the sense of I'm the kind of person that will do X, Y, Z. I'm the kind of person that likes to be in nature, that likes to look after nature, that likes to care for nature. So it's more a sense of how do I see myself in relation to the natural environment. To be honest, there's a lot of overlap with this idea of philosophy, and as I said, the dimensions are really correlated anyway in the work that I've done. But I guess the philosophy dimension is more a sense of sort of spirituality, so or a sense of responsibility around relationship. So there was one paper, a series of papers a little while ago that talked about different relationships in the sense of, do I see myself as a steward of nature? Am I responsible for looking after it? Do I see my relationship with nature more as a dominant kind of thing? I can take what I want from nature, and there's sort of different variations in between. And so I guess the philosophical dimension was more about that kind of relationship. Where do I see myself relative to nature? And it's often on that sort of the typical way of looking at it is that the idea of dominance versus care for, or a partner with nature. We are all one. We are all part of the same nature.
Yeah, and I think that actually links really well onto Keisha's question. So, and he says, could you explain perhaps how important is the attitude and worldviews? So thinking about anthropocentrism or bioecentrism to connect to nature, so how does that, I suppose, is that the philosophical sort of dimension that you're talking about there?
Yeah, they're sort of they're related constructs, but they kind of run in parallel and sort of overlap slightly, I guess. The idea of like a worldview for me almost ties into that idea of values, environmental values, and we know that the people that are very pro-environmental in their values again have a very strong connection with nature typically. The more materialist values as the flip side, if I'm more concerned with money and wealth and status, that's associated with lower connection scores. So I guess with anything in the connection with nature space, these constructs overlap. They're quite similar, and they share a lot of similarities. And we talk about one predicting the other, but when you look at the properties from a statistical perspective, psychometrically, there's so much similarity in them. Was actually one of my thesis examiners actually said to me, this proliferation of terminology, we kind of need to have a conversation about, are we talking about the same thing, or are they sort of related? Do they run in parallel? So to what extent do worldviews overlap with connection? Well, probably a lot. Is it worth distinguishing them? Your guess is as good as mine. Sorry, a bit of a vague answer.
That's right. We have another question here from Andrew. Andrew, are you still with us online? Would you care to sort of talk about it? I can read it, but perhaps you can just you could do it yourself if you don't mind.
Thank you. Andrew here from Penrith Council. I suppose I'm really interested in nature playgrounds, and certainly over the last 5 to 10 years, seeing that shift towards including nature play elements and playgrounds. And there's some really amazing, high quality, very immersive playgrounds that are done on quite a large scale. I suppose my interest is particularly more on the smaller scale suburban parks, where we're looking at things like sandstone seating and bark chip soft floor instead of plastic soft floor and that kind of things. I know at a broad level that there's a strong correlation between nature play and that going on to form nature connections, and I can certainly see that playing out in those larger scale, higher quality spaces. Just wondering if there's any research or any evidence that shows that even just, simple things like changing material usage in suburban parks, if that's having an impact, or whether that's not something that's been researched yet.
Not a body of literature I'm familiar with, but my instinct says it probably would make a difference. So one of the things I looked at in one of the other papers that I didn't talk about in this presentation was looking at different types of nature, and is spending time in, say, a wilderness area as important for building connection as spending time in an urban park? And it seems to be yes, particularly coming back to that idea of access. If you grow up in a city centre and all you have access to is a local park, that can sometimes be enough to nurture a sense of connection. And again, sometimes a pot plant, if we think about nature as a pot plant on my windowsill, sometimes that's enough to nurture connection. It's about sort of access. It's about what you have ability to sort of spend time and interact with. And given this idea of connection depends on that kind of active experience, if you're actively engaging with playgrounds, for example, that have those natural elements, a child falls over and hits the ground and picks up the chip bark, for example, that's going to be a different type of interaction to if they fall down, hit the ground and interact with the squishy artificial turf. So again, I can't talk to the literature. It's not something I'm familiar with, but my guess would be it does make a difference. But I'll have a look and I'll see what I can find. And if I come across anything, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks. We have another question here from Mary Bell. Sorry, I also have really loud power tools outside my house now. Sorry about that, everyone. The timing is just perfect, isn't it? So Mary Bell said, I'd like to know how we can use a nature connection tool to help people see their level of connection and approach it ethically. Is that something that you've seen or read about in practice?
It's off the top of my head, not that I've seen in practice, but I think it would actually make sense. If I think about my work as a psychologist, biofeedback is a really powerful way of providing feedback to someone. So if they can actually, if they're doing exercise, for example, and they can see a heart rate monitor and they can actually see the blip on the screen, that's a really powerful way of feeding back that information. And so if you're using a tool, a connection with nature tool, to show people how their connection changes over time and feeding that back to them, I think that would be really useful, because they can see, at the moment I'm on a 7, and then after this activity I go up to a 9, and then after the next activity I go up to a 12. It's like, oh, my connection's increasing. So I think it's a really useful tool, a useful way to use the instruments, for sure. And particularly if you're looking at like the INS with a simple scale of where do you fit on the circles, it can be a really useful way of providing that kind of immediate feedback, and also tapping to that idea of state connection. So, if you're doing a program on a really cold and wet day, your connection scores might be lower than you do it 3 months later when it's a beautiful and sunny day. So giving them that kind of feedback as well would be interesting.
So potential, so that the CN12 that you've used, like that's sort of a tool you think that could be used in this context, like, providing to people that are doing the program beforehand and providing with their own responses, perhaps.
Absolutely. The CN12 tool we developed as a measure of trait connections. So one thing I didn't talk about much was you can tweak the wording of questions to make them state versus trait. Unfortunately, the way that the questions were worded in the CN12, it's more a trait. It doesn't actually measure the state as well. It's a bit harder to kind of tweak the wording, but you could still use it, particularly to see how this changes over time. And particularly if you start at the beginning and the scores are fairly low, and then you do it again after a period of time and the scores have increased, you would definitely see how that might have changed. Also too, I feel that the experiential dimension of the CN12 would be useful to capture immediately after a program, because it's something that you've done in that moment, because usually you're actually out into nature, experiencing nature at the time. So yeah, absolutely, that would be useful.
Sorry, I've just looked down at Chloe's question. And so Chloe said, do we yet know whether the use of technology is working to better engage teenagers with nature? So that was something you sort of touched on briefly, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of an ongoing discussion. Given that connection dips in adolescence anyway, the argument goes that there's a lot of competing demands for the adolescent brain, and often things like social relationships and technology kind of trumps nature. So it's a bit of an uphill battle, I guess, with this particular subgroup of people. But there does seem to be the gamification idea, the using of apps, for example, does seem to be really useful for engaging. But again, is it that state type stuff? Is it in that moment, or does it have a more enduring effect? There's not a lot of longitudinal research looking at how things change over time in the connection with nature space. So most of it seems to be at this moment. It's correlational, it's kind of cross-sectional. We haven't done a lot of work how things change over time. So it's a really good question to know whether it has a long-term impact. I'll let you know if I ever find out. It'd be fascinating.
Thanks, Melissa. We've got a question from Victoria. Victoria, if you're there, did you want to ask your question? I've got noise here.
Sure, I was just writing something in the chat. Okay, so I have done a lot of work around climate anxiety, climate grief, emotions, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to get into kids' education programs, nature education programs. And I'm really curious about your thoughts on this sort of balance that we sit on about how much awareness do we want to be giving kids about the threats to nature and kind of the reality of the world versus kind of polluting their relationship with nature, so that when they're out in nature, they might be having this really rare experience and feeling really open and really wonderful. And then we dump on them like, oh yeah, this is, you know, at threat from this, this and this. And I feel like that's a bit of a kind of contemporary balance that we all sort of go along. And I'd just love to know your research kind of infused perspective on that question.
Yeah, there's a really, I'm so glad you asked that question. There's some really interesting elements to that. So in my work as a psychologist, I deal with climate anxiety quite a lot. And one of the mechanisms that we use for helping people manage climate anxiety is getting involved, getting active. And connecting with nature seems to be really important too. So getting people to get out and appreciate and encourage and develop that connection helps with anxiety, the climate anxiety. On the flip side, there are a couple of papers actually that have been published in the last few years. Susan Clayton looked at responses to polluted landscapes and how that influenced connection. I can't remember the exact details of the findings, but I'll find the paper and I'll let you know. But she looked at this idea of, yes, you can sit there and you could look at a beautiful landscape. Does it differ if that landscape has got rubbish all through it, for example, in terms of how that plays out in connection? And I can't remember the findings, but it was something that they looked at. Louise Chawla also did some work looking at, again, this idea of climate and particularly amongst kids. So getting them to wanting to nurture and connect with nature, knowing that on the flip side, we're destroying nature. And how this then plays out. It's not an area that's been researched to a great extent, but I think it's got some really useful applications moving forward. And I think it's an area that really does need to be a lot more researched. As you say, if we're losing nature from, you know, if you were trying to, for example, take someone to one of the areas that was devastated in the Black Summer bushfires, how would that play out in terms of their connection? Would that lead to that sense of grief and loss? And how would that relate back to connection? It's a really good question. The short answer is, don't know.
Can I come back just super quick, not to
Please.
document anything, but do you think it's better to allow kids to just have a pure, wonderful experience with nature versus trying to enlighten them, you know, about the issues at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a delicate balance. Encouraging them to see the beauty and appreciate the awe and the wonder of nature is an important part, but the reality is also important to know. So I think it's a bit of that delicate balance. And this ties into what I was saying about how we haven't done a lot of research into those negative emotions. So what's happening when we are telling kids the reality of what's happening with nature? How is this then playing out? So it's something that really needs to be done. For me, I think it's about finding that balance. And if I again put my psychologist hat on, sometimes the communication is about that kind of sandwich of appreciate nature, but we're destroying it, but it's really great. So, that kind of sandwiching information.
And I think that does also relate to a question that we had from Jen Cunningham. Jen was interested in, she said, could you revisit the main points about nature connects in adolescence? And I think she's probably talking about that graph. So does that graph suggest more work can be done with this age group? I think because there was a bit of a dip, wasn't there, when it sort of looked at that, connection to nature and adolescence.
Yeah, I don't do work with adolescents, I'm afraid. I'm not a good person to talk to in that sense. But I'd have to go back and find some literature to let you know. My work has been all with adults, so I'm fortunate to get them at the other end of the scale when the connection comes back up again. But I think a lot of the literature is looking at, it's almost about maintaining as connection as best we can, to try not to let it dip off too much, and knowing that hopefully when they kind of mature a little bit more, the connection will come back up again. As I sort of mentioned before, there's always competing priorities with adolescents. So it's about slotting into connection where as best as you can, in the hope that it doesn't sort of dip off too much.
So Jen, maybe something we can come back to another time as well. So I've got a question from Charlene. Charlene, are you there? Did you want to read your question?
Hi guys. Victoria, I'll just touch on the ecological grief side of just things before I go into my question. I've always been connected with nature, but after the bushfires, we were heavily affected. I got really sick, and so nature really healed me. At that time, my garden healed me, and I spent a lot of time sitting in my garden, and that's my connection with nature when I can't get out. So it was a really good point. Thank you. So my question is, okay, for the people who are already connected with nature, it's really easy for them to invite them into a program, and they're going to come and do a walk with us or whatever. So the challenge is to get those people that are on the fence, not really sure where they're at, to get them into these programs so we can start to get more people connected with nature. So obviously storytelling is possibly one of those ways that we can do that. So I'm kind of keen to know if other ideas. So how can we elevate this? How can we improve this situation that we're actually in?
$1 million question, how to get the unengaged engaged.
Yeah.
One of the things I have looked at, not in my PhD, but sort of in my work as a behavioral scientist, is sometimes finding out what's important to the person as a hook. So for example, if we want someone to change recycling behavior, sometimes it's about appealing to, recycling is good for the environment. And sometimes it's about, well, imagine the less rubbish you're going to have to throw out, or the money you'll save, or that kind of thing. Sometimes it's about finding that hook that may not be what we think is going to be the hook, but is going to work for that person. And so for the unengaged, my thinking is, well, what will motivate them? Will they be motivated by money? Will they be motivated by, spending time with someone, with a, whatever else might be that hook? We know that group activities in nature, so spending time in nature with a group of people, a social kind of event, can sometimes be the hook that you need. For me, it's also about getting people to experience nature in that richer kind of sense as well. So, grab this leaf, crunch it up, notice the smell. What does it smell like? It smells pretty good, doesn't it? Notice the colors. How many different shades of green can you see? Sometimes it's about piquing curiosity in those kinds of ways. But I guess the by and large, I would say, what's going to be the hook for that group of people? If you're trying to get adolescents in, can you get them in with technology, for example?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And we have a question now. It is the $1 million question, isn't it, really? We have another question from Emma. Emma, did you want to read your question out for us?
Hi.
Hey,
Sorry, I wrote a really difficult question, but my challenge is that, I have to work with a team of people, and much of my work is nature connection, while others are doing maybe more sustainability focused activities.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I might have to fight to have one question in our generic feedback form. And, you know, I really liked how you touched on points, you know, did it produce positive emotions? Did you understand the meaning of this place? Did you feel less stressed? You know, I could put those questions in. And I think maybe do happy face, sad face, or, you know, make it quite easy for people in a feedback form. But my challenge is, you know, I might only get one chance to put one question in. And what's the most important, and how do I make it so it's not a triple barrel question? How do I, you know, what in your experience, if there's one thing that you could ask someone, what would it be?
Ask someone to try to capture their connection with nature or something else?
Well, how, you know, how they've felt after being on a nature connection activity that say I've run, or, you know, post-activity experience.
Yep.
You know, I've really, in reality, I've got one short question.
My instinct is saying using something like that pictorial inclusion of nature in self-scale, because it is only a single question, and it captures connection in a relatively broad kind of way, but it's still a really useful proxy measure for what else is going on.
So that was the two circles moving together.
The concentric circles kind of coming in. If you just Google inclusion of nature in self, there's a gazillion different versions online, so it's really accessible. To be able to dig down into the nuance of the cognitions, the emotions, the relationship, that requires many more questions. And if I had to pick one over another, I'd be like, don't make me choose. I almost would think you want to capture connection in its general kind of sense. Because of the, I mean, identity is, I mean, you could say, you know, to what extent do you identify with the natural environment? But even then, people...
It's not clear enough.
No, it's a bit vague for some people, which is why those questionnaires that have multiple questions kind of come towards the same thing. So my thinking would be, another way I've seen it done is, if you don't want to use the circles, is just asking someone how connected to nature do you feel? Not at all to very much, or how close to nature do you feel? Very close, very far away. Those kinds of ideas are often a bit of a quick and dirty way of capturing, at least in a proxy measure.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Emma.
I think that kind of Chris, hi, if you're there, Chris Hellier. Chris had a similar question as well. Chris, do you feel like that helps you answer your question? You sort of said if you're approaching a community with 2 or 3 questions to assess their nature connections, what would you consider the most informative and valuable?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess it's just a slightly expanded version of Emma's question. I'm in a very similar position where I'm looking at doing a bit of community outreach and I guess not expecting people to answer all that many questions, or maybe a little entry form that includes a couple of questions. So I guess you've already answered it to some extent. The second component, I guess, of my question was, is there a difference between assessing their nature connection and getting them to sort of maybe prompt them to consider something that they might not have otherwise? I mean, I guess a single question has them doing that in the first place, but yeah, I'm trying to work out exactly what my goals are in surveying the community and what's to be gained. So yeah, excuse the vagueness.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking sometimes it can be useful to think about or asking people to reflect on their experience. So you might only get one question, but do you have an open-ended question, for example? Can you ask them to sort of write a sentence? And if you get them to maybe write a few words about how did that make you feel? What did you think about in response to that? That might be a way of prompting people to kind of offer a bit more information rather than just a single question. Again, some people are quite happy to write sentences. Other people are like, don't ask me this stupid question. Reluctant to provide anything. So
no, I like that. Yeah. So prompting some kind of recall or memory or feeling.
Yeah. Encouraging people to reflect on their experience of nature, encouraging people to reflect on how it made them feel, what they noticed, what emotions do you feel, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Melissa. It's been great.
Welcome.
Thanks. I am just walking through the different questions. There are a couple more sort of about the adolescents, but I do notice that you said, Melissa, it's not particularly your area of expertise. So we might hold on to those maybe for, you know, if we find some more information out, we can share that with people in a follow-up email. And Ree's also asked about passing on details of a paper. So just letting people know that Melissa has a list of resources for us. So I'm going to email that out to everyone at the end of the session. So, you know, some of that, she's referred to quite a lot of papers in the presentation. So that will be there. We've got a question from Jane. Jane Chalker, are you there? Did you want to ask a question? Maybe Jane's is more of a comment about, she says,
it was a comment.
Yeah. Sorry, Jane,
I couldn't unmute myself, sorry.
Yeah. That's all right. Yeah. So sort of looking about truth telling about nature and connecting and children's experiences of that as well. So sorry, I'm just looking through. Hugh, are you there? Did you have a question for us as well?
No, I don't have a question. It was just a couple of observations just about the relationship between the different scales of experience of nature in that the people interested in how far do you go in your interactions as educators with young people in burdening them with the whole weight of the global challenges of climate change and the biodiversity crisis versus leaving them with a more pure, untainted experience of nature. That really, it's at the local scale where people can have a personal connection and that can support meaningful action. And so it's really important to preserve that, and then they can grow an awareness of how we deal with the greater challenges from a basis of connection at that local scale.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. It is true. I think the local is a good space for looking at your experiences.
And the other thought I had, which was related, was just about the influence of technology on the human experience of nature, particularly for young people today, where so much of their relationships with the world is mediated through technology. And that can actually be really quite disempowering. In contrast, say, to a young person growing up in an Indigenous tribal context without the imposition of that technology, who has a much greater access to the rich, deep experience of raw nature. And so it's like giving young people time out from technology in an immersive experience in nature can be foundational in them forming that deeper commitment and connection that we see later in life manifesting as a commitment to do something meaningful in their environment or for their environment.
And a similar thing with that, one of the papers I looked at talked about how nature is defined. So when we think about nature, we often think about untouched wilderness. We think about things that are kind of over there, away from the human experience, that are completely separate and devoid of human touch, human interference. But this particular paper talked about nature is everywhere. You know, we are nature. And we sometimes have this kind of almost romanticized vision of nature is that wilderness type area. But maybe what we need to do is to encourage thinking about nature as at your front door, as your nature strip, as that tree in the schoolyard. Getting people to think differently about their relationship with nature from the sense about what actually is nature. And that sort of then leads into the idea of, you know, urban parks are useful for nature, because even though they're kind of, you know, constructed and don't appear like wilderness as such, they're still nature. They're still important. So, and that then has a potential of shifting our idea of, you know, humans as being dominant over nature versus humans being part of nature. All of those sort of ideas.
And nature is relative. It's a relative
absolutely
concept.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we have any more questions? Did anyone have any question that they wanted to present to Melissa from the floor? Any questions from the floor? Cara, do you want to turn your volume up for me, Cara?
Hang on. I don't know. Is that working?
Yeah, a little bit more.
Oh, I'm technologically disadvantaged.
No,
right.
look, we've got you. We've got you.
Can
yeah,
just hear you.
Just you.
So I'd like to ask regarding the scales, whether or not you would find it appropriate to use them when asking people about their memories as children experiencing nature, because with nature play and what I've done as an early childhood educator, bringing parents into the fold, that's one of my key questions that I lead with, is for them to consider what their experience was in nature and what they would like their children to then experience based around that.
Yep.
Would that scale, would that be applied obviously to that?
There's a bit of proceed with caution in that sense. So the questionnaires, the scales that we talked about that I introduced in this presentation were more about, you know, now, experiences now, or in the kind of, you know, immediate sort of realm. Asking retrospectively always comes with a bit of a caveat in terms of, well, how well does memory work? Are we tainted by, we know with questionnaires, for example, you can take a questionnaire at this moment and then you can do it again in an hour's time, and whatever happens in that hour can influence the results of the question. So if you think about that in terms of retrospective, what happened when I was a kid 30 years ago, it's necessarily going to be tainted. I don't think that makes it invaluable. I think it's still possible, as long as you kind of put that little caveat on there to say, we asked about connection, but it is asking people to remember something that happened a long time ago. But it's quite often when we talk about childhood experiences, it's asking adults to reflect on their experiences as kids. And a lot of the work that Louise Chawler has done has been about that. So as I said, there's not much in terms of longitudinal studies where we ask a 5-year-old and then we ask them every 10 years until they get to 50. That research just doesn't exist. I mean, that would be amazing if it did. But a lot of what we do is retrospective reflection anyway. So it's kind of the best we've got at this moment in time. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks, Cara. Do we have any more? Victoria, you have another question for us?
Yeah, I just wanted to tap back into what you were saying about how there's a real lack of insight into multicultural kind of perspectives on nature, and that the programs are so often sort of based on Westerners and white people. And I guess I just wanted to comment that I see that as a gap. Like, I've been in environment for a long time, and with our multicultural communities, and really getting a greater understanding of what has shaped their attitudes to nature. How could we facilitate a closer connection to nature? Because often there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of like really negative emotions around nature. And I'd love to see that become more of a focus of opening up those channels and seeing that as something that's a really important part of the environmental movement generally.
100% agree. I think it's a massive gap that really needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was an interesting paper that came out of America, and a lot of the work that comes out of the US talks about they have a very strong racial focus. So they look at white people versus Black people versus Latino. And this particular study was looking at how the ideas of African Americans and their connection with nature might differ, given that the sort of historical context of lynchings in nature and that kind of stuff, whether that had an influence. So there is a little bit of work being done trying to compare this type of thing, but it's a really big gap. It definitely needs to be. I mean, in much of the psychology literature, we get first-year psychology students because they're a captive audience, and there's a big issue with the way psychology research is conducted, but they're the people that we've got. But yeah, I agree. It's definitely an area that needs more.
It seems like sometimes there's this thing that when people are coming, particularly from areas where there's a lot of poverty, that connection with nature is sort of associated with like peasants and people that are beneath them. And it's something that as people start to become middle class and you know, get money and professionalism, that they leave behind as this sort of relic of a more primitive kind of way of life. And that makes that can make them really, really hard to reach in Australia as an audience.
Yep. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Talking on mute. Andrew did mention the work in New South Wales, the New South Wales ECC, the Ethnic Communities Council. So a few years back, they actually had I do know about the program, Andrew. They had like a group of bilingual educators as well that would go out and work with their communities as well, and like, you know, the Spanish speaking people working in Spanish communities, and that was a fabulous program. So, but it was so there is some work. I'm not sure how much work they're doing at the moment, but it's probably something to follow up on and share if there is as well. So I am just mindful of the time, Melissa, that it's about 2 minutes to 1. So I feel like it's probably a good time to wrap up. I am because it is an evaluation workshop, I am just going to put a cheeky evaluation survey in the link for everyone. I know how much everyone loves evaluation. My tool is nowhere near as sophisticated as Melissa's. Mine's one of those really quick 5 questions. Could you please answer? So if everyone had a moment while they're still here or just before they leave to just reflect on the seminar and the session, that would be really great if you could do that for us. And I would also like to, give some great thanks to Melissa again. It's been really interesting having you talk and share all your knowledge with us. And, it's a passionate community of people that are really interested in this. And it's really great to be able to, really build our knowledge and get some more tools that we might be able to use in our education practice. So
thank you for having me. This has been a passion project of mine for a long time. So I could talk about it till the cows come home. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Great.
Bye.